Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. My name is Taylor Ward, she, her, and I am the Senior Manager of Communications and Education at Just Solutions. I am calling in from Land, also known as Fresno, California, and we're excited to welcome you to the Leveraging State Law to Address Local Pollution Burden webinar. Thank you all for being here. For those who don't know, Just Solutions is a national organization that drives innovative, equitable solutions to the climate crisis in support of healthy, resilient communities and accountable democratic institutions. We ground our work in the broader movement for environmental justice and the guiding principle that frontline communities most harmed by climate change should lead in creating and implementing the solutions. If you're joining us, please feel free to add your name, your organization, and your location in the chat so we can know who else is on the call today. Just Solutions acknowledges that we occupy the stolen land of Turtle Island, home to countless Native tribes and nations. We recognize the ongoing struggles and violence Indigenous communities face and honor Indigenous knowledge, wisdom, and activism. We are committed to supporting justice for Indigenous communities by reflecting this conviction in our work. If you haven't done so before, you can check out native-land.ca to find out whose land you're on and find more tools to support Native advocacy in your area. The purpose of today's webinar is to learn how pollution burdens disproportionately impact frontline communities and the innovative state-level policy solutions that advocates are utilizing to create more equitable environmental protections. And if you have any questions throughout today's event, our Q&A box is open, and as you can see, the chat is open as well. So please feel free to put any questions that you might have there, and we will have a dedicated Q&A period. We'll be able to get to your questions. So as questions pop up, please feel free to add them to the Q&A box. These are our speakers today, who each will be doing a little bit more of a bio during their sections. We are going to kick it off with passing it to Idalmis to give us some background on how states are taking the lead. And Idalmis, please feel free to introduce yourself during this section, and then we'll continue on from there. So Idalmis, if you want to kick us off.
Sure thing. Thanks, Taylor. Hi, everyone. My name is Idalmis. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a senior policy analyst at Just Solutions. And I am based in Los Angeles, also Tongvalan. And so as Taylor mentioned, there are a number of states, including Minnesota, Massachusetts, New York, and New Jersey, that are going ahead and looking towards using their own state permitting rules and authorities to advance environmental justice, and knowing that the US EPA is not doing enough to address air pollution with their own authority. So these laws vary state to state based on the facilities or projects the laws apply to, and whether it gives the implementing state agency the power to deny permits for new and or existing facilities. And so, for example, states like California and Massachusetts require agencies to undertake a cumulative impact analysis in environmental impact statements, but their laws do not give the state the authority to approve or deny permits based on the analysis conducted. And then we have New York and New Jersey, which grant their state agencies the authority to deny permits for new facilities, and in New York goes even further by granting the authority to deny permits for existing facilities. And so we're seeing here that the critical innovation is that the cumulative impact analysis can become a binding factor in permitting decisions. So as we look towards a future and the potential outcomes of the 2024 election, action at the state level will be critical to not only safeguard our rights to clean air, but also to a healthy environment. And so to learn more about what states are doing with the cumulative impacts laws, we are bringing to Ana Bautista to tell us more about the New Jersey law. Ana is an associate professor of professional practice in the Environmental Policy and Sustainability Management graduate program at the Milano School of Policy Management and the Environment. She also serves as co-director of the Tishman Environment and Design Center at the New School. Anna's professional practice is based primarily in community engaged scholarship and critical participatory action research. Her ongoing work with environmental justice issues is based in her hometown of Newark, New Jersey. I'm also excited to introduce Sonal Jessel, who will be talking to us about New York's law. Sonal was previously the director of policy for We Act for Environmental Justice, where she advanced the organization's policy agenda at the local, state, and national level. Before joining We Act, Sonal conducted research in energy insecurity, housing, and public health at Columbia University, from where she also holds a master's degree in public health. Welcome both. And so I'd like to get us started by asking both of you to speak on some of the reasons or issues that communities you partner with decided to pursue a cumulative impact state law. We can get started with Anna.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for the warm welcome. I'm happy to join you all in this conversation along with Sanal. Yeah, in New Jersey, the impetus, environmental justice organizations on the ground like Ironbound Community Corps and Newark and New Jersey EJ Alliance, we have been working on an EJ law and cumulative impacts policies for like over a decade. Because as many folks who have, struggled permit by permit to try to fight industries that continue to target EJ communities for pollution, it's very difficult to ever really produce a different outcome with the existing laws that we have, because the state would always come back and say, well, we don't have the authority to say no on the grounds of cumulative impacts. We can consider it, we can do risk analysis, but that's it. It really wouldn't go beyond that. And so on the basis of that assertion, which we disagreed with, we actually believe the states have the authority in their existing statutes to actually weigh and consider these things. But they, of course, refuse to exercise that, that ability, that discretion. And so we pushed and had model bills. We worked with different legislators at different times. We also worked on federal policy around cumulative impacts. And, when the opportunity arose politically in the state, when we had leadership, both legislative in the legislature and in the governor's office, that were amenable to EJ policies that were more explicit about that commitment, we were ready because we had built this policy over many, many years, and were able to introduce model legislation on the basis of that work. But it was an effort, a group effort by a small coalition of EJ groups that had been working on the issue for a long time.
Thank you. We could go to Sonal.
Thanks. Yeah, so in New York, there were a lot of kind of similar factors that Anna said, where for communities across New York and New York City, that folks have been dealing with the cumulative impacts of many polluting facilities in their backyard for a very long time. I mean, working on cumulative impacts is like one of the pillar focuses of environmental justice in the US and in the world. And so it's always been a problem. And it's the reason why a lot of the organizations that are in the room today and why a lot of our other organizations even exist is this issue of all of the toxics, all facilities, all the air quality issues, all the environmental hazards are always placed in the same communities on top of each other. So in terms of an issue, like Anna said, this is something that folks have been working on for a very long time on the national side, but also in New York as well. For New York, there was a bill that was introduced, someone told me in the 90s on cumulative impacts, and it didn't go very far. It was kind of sitting around for a really long time. And after New Jersey passed their bill, we kind of thought we had the momentum and the influence to be able to do something similar in New York. So we were really excited that New Jersey did it. We were able to kind of use that momentum to push us forward as well. And so we had a coalition. It was led by myself at We Act, and then we had another key environmental justice partner, South Bronx Unite, who represent the South Bronx, which has some of the highest asthma rates and some of the worst air quality issues in the country. And then we had a lot of other partners that were working with us to help support the work. New York Lawyers for Public Interest. We had a couple of the bigger green groups to kind of give us support as well, like Earth Justice and the Sierra Club and NRDC. And then there were a ton of organizations across the state that would participate in advocacy and reach out to their legislators and really help move that forward. And at one point we had the support of over 200 organizations. So I won't list all of them, but there were so many folks that were really excited about this legislation. And we kind of took the bill that was sitting around for a very long time and revived it and sort of jiggered it to be applicable to 2021 or 2022 when we were working on it, where we were able to do what you already summarized really well, which is kind of two components. One is to give the state clear authority to deny permits for some of the most toxic types of facilities if they're increasing what we call the pollution burden, or disproportionate burden is used in New York. In vulnerable communities in New York, we use the term disadvantaged communities because that is what the state's climate law says. And then the second piece of the bill gives the state authority to deny permits or kind of put restrictions and like mitigation rules on permits for existing polluting facilities. I think that our partners, our community partners, and the environmental justice folks would have wanted an even more strict version of the mitigation efforts for existing facilities. But we were really happy to kind of get some good language in there on that. And then I'll say the piece that we feel like we didn't win that New Jersey has that we were really excited about is the public participation component that is written into the legislation in New Jersey that we didn't get written in New York. New York does have some good regulations already around public participation, but that is an area that we still need to make stronger in New York.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I'd love to hear a little bit, if you can explain to us a little bit more about the law itself, but and those public participation tools, but also if you can speak to a little bit on the hurdles that you faced in the development of the regulation.
Yeah, the New Jersey bill is a little bit different. I mean, all the bills are slightly different. The ones that have been passed in states, they take on slightly different methodologies to approach cumulative impacts. In New Jersey, the bill first defines overburdened communities, which is a little bit of a misnomer because that definition is really typically used to denote communities where there's disproportionate burden. And so there's some environmental data that's associated with that. But in New Jersey, the definition of overburden is what we usually call environmental justice or disadvantaged communities, because it's on the basis strictly of sociodemographics. So it's race, income, linguistic isolation. And it basically breaks up the entire state by census block group according to these thresholds of race, income, and linguistic isolation. And, census block groups that are above those thresholds are considered overburdened or EJ communities. And it says that if you are, triggering one of these 7 or 8 different types of permits, the most important of which are the larger, Title V permits that are usually for large industries, large emitters, but also scrap metal yards, transfer facilities, a lot of the traditional, what we did in New Jersey is we looked at the typical types of permitting that we see in overburdened communities and really tried to capture that universe of noxious facilities that are common in New Jersey that may not be common in other states, right? Or, so each state has its own sort of characteristics of things that they really want to tackle, and knowing that you're not maybe going to capture everything. So you kind of have to prioritize. So we have 7 or 8 different types of uses and permits that are captured there. If you are one of those permits and you're in an what we call an overburden block group, you trigger this law and you trigger this review process. And the law sets out a process by which the law simply says if this proposed facility is in an overburdened community and it causes or contributes to cumulative burdens, public health and environmental stressors, then it must be denied. So that's a very important piece of the bill that was very hard fought, was the must be denied, not may be denied. And so it mandates the denial on that basis. Now, after the law was passed, and else it applies to, as you said, renewals in a different way. And the renewals, you can't deny outright, but you can modify. You can modify the permit and put new restrictions on existing permits that come up for renewal. The hard part of implementing this law, like most laws, is in the nitty-gritty rulemaking. There's one thing is you have the law, and the law sets out the intent of the legislature to protect the communities, but then it's handed over in New Jersey, it's handed over to the regulatory agency who is going to be implementing the law, and they have to create rules. That's the rulemaking process. That rulemaking process took over 2 years in New Jersey because we were building a methodology for how exactly does something cause or contribute to public and environmental health stressors? How do you make that determination? And this is where the DEP developed a whole, 26 stressors. They looked at these, they added up the stressors, they looked at the average in relationship to state and county levels. And using that methodology that I won't get into because it's very technical, but I'll leave if people want to know more about that, I can share that. They can make that determination. And I would say the hardest, there were many difficult roadblocks on the way to implementing the bill, but one of the most important ones is once laws are passed, they require rulemaking. It's very technical and tedious, but very important because that's where the nitty-gritty rubber meets the road. Like, is this law actually going to have the intended effect that we want? And if it's not, if you don't have a strong rule, a really tightly fitted rule, then you could leave big, huge loopholes in the law. And we saw that. So industry came out not as much in opposition to the law, but very heavily in opposition in the rulemaking process. So they use the rulemaking process, and even in the very last stages post public comment, to try to influence the governor's office and the state agencies to water down this rule. And that was a thing that we had to anticipate, is how do you push back the industry's attempts to water down and create loopholes that effectively make your rule, not have any teeth in the rulemaking process. And then, of course, you have to anticipate that you will have challenges, but post implementation. But that was a very important lesson.
Thank you for that. Yeah, Sonal, if you could walk us through some of the issues you saw in the development of the law or the implementation process, I'd love to hear how it was in New York.
Yeah, and we're a little bit behind New Jersey in the process. And so right now, New York is in the rulemaking stage where they're making very critical decisions on the implementation. So that's where we are now. But when the advocacy and the campaign for passing the cumulative impacts legislation in New York was about 2 years ago now, it is set to go into effect January, this upcoming January, so January 2025. And getting the bill passed was certainly work, but like Anna said, I do expect a lot of the kind of sneaky resistance will happen in the rulemaking stage. But there was a lot of concern when we were working on this bill. There was a lot of concern from municipalities and about how to actually follow the new permitting process, and what to do around existing facilities. Originally, the language was a lot stronger around existing facilities, saying that the Department of Environmental Conservation, DEC, who has the authority over this in New York State, would be able to deny permits for existing facilities if they continue to essentially contribute to disproportionate burden. And the language in the New York State is cause or contribute to disproportionate burden is the language used in New York State. And there was a lot of pushback on that. Particularly, that was kind of the biggest hurdle when getting the bill passed, and that was the biggest part of negotiation, was finding a way to keep some language in there around facilities that already exist. And this was really important, as I think a lot of our audience here knows, is we're not just trying to prevent future pollution issues. We are trying to also actively reduce existing pollution problems in communities. And so that means we need to be addressing the facilities that are already polluting communities. And so that was really important for the, moving this bill forward from the environmental justice side. But there was a lot of pushback there. So there had to be a lot of negotiation, a lot of back and forth with particularly municipalities that were small or were responsible for a large amount of facilities that are supposedly necessary for public health, say a wastewater treatment facility, things like that. That's where we saw a lot of the pushback. And then, not surprisingly, we also saw a lot of pushback from the business community, where they're concerned that it will be harder to get permits approved for big facilities that they want to be building up. And the argument, of course, from our side was, well, you shouldn't be putting polluting facilities in environmental justice communities. And if you might get your permit denied because it's very polluting, then something's wrong with your facility and you need to make it cleaner, is the ideal, and or site it somewhere else. And so that was the sort of toughest part of the negotiations. And similar to what Anna said, some of the tougher parts was getting really strong language in the bill that says that facilities have to do a burden report, which is really important. Just getting down on paper the fact that the facilities know they're part of a cumulative burden is really important, not only for making permitting decisions, but also for any kind of protections that communities might want in the future, whether that is something that they want to pursue, and through other avenues, having this evidence of that a facility knows they're contributing to cumulative burden is a really powerful environmental justice tool. And so, it was a battle to kind of get some strength in the language that are saying that these reports have to be done, they shall be done, that permits shall be denied based off of, causing or contributing to disproportionate pollution burden. Our language says, it says for new facilities, they cannot contribute a de minimis pollution burden, I think is what it says, which is basically like as close to zero as possible. If you have anything more than that, then you shall be denied. So the language for new facilities is quite strong, but for existing facilities, it gives DEC a lot of room to kind of do it case by case basis. And so that was some of the harder points to negotiate. And I think that any state, any organizations that are moving through this process in their states will find the same thing. I think that this is going to be a concern for any state you're working in, is like, what about the facilities we already have? There's a desire for governments to grandfather in existing polluting facilities, and how do we really find ways to fight against that? Otherwise, the pollution burden will continue. And then now we're in the rulemaking stage where our Office of Environmental Justice and DEC are really great. They're working on making it clear, like sort of defining what is an increase in disproportionate burden. What does pollution burden mean? What does de minimis mean? How do you decide whether one community is getting burdened more than another community when you cite this facility? So there's a lot of like little things in there, and it gets very much in the weeds when you start looking at these questions. But luckily, a lot of amazing organizations in New York are involved and heavily a part of this process. And our state just held a session on this week. They're doing another one next week. So They are doing a fairly good job with working with environmental justice organizations on the rulemaking, but certainly we'll have to see where it goes as it gets more defined. We do expect some folks to kind of come out and have some resistance towards it and want rules to be bent a little bit more. So we'll have to see where that goes.
Thanks, Sonal. Yeah, I think there's you're getting to some of the next question, which I love the transition. So what are 2 to 3 tips you could give our audience on how to successfully strategize and hopefully pass a cumulative impacts bill or law in their state?
Yeah, it's always hard to be like, just 2 or 3 tips. Like I need a million tips.
I agree.
And honestly, like the EJ groups, the grassroots EJ groups in each state really know the political landscape and conditions on the ground best, to be able to ascertain what are the opportunities that they have. First of all, what are the biggest threats that they want to address in a bill? And 2, what are some of the champions or allies that they can muster to try to organize around a model bill. And one of the things we learned in New Jersey is we had a relatively small coalition of EJ groups that have been doing this a long time and had deep knowledge. But then we quickly tried to pull in a coalition of social justice, civil rights, like groups that, were not traditional sort of environmental NGOs, but although they were supportive as well, but groups that represented a lot of the communities, even if they were representing them on different issues, to shore up support of the bill in the legislature, and finding those legislative champions who are willing to take the lead and the wisdom of the EJ communities in the drafting of the bill. It's really important, I think, not to let the bill, like people, groups that are, they run with a bill and they're not accountable to the EJ communities where the impacts are mostly felt. Because they may put things in the bill or put forward a bill that's a lot weaker or doesn't really address the core issues that communities need addressed. And worse than not having a cumulative impacts bill is having a bill that says it's about cumulative impacts and actually doesn't materially help those communities, because then the legislature can say, well, we've already taken care of that problem. We have a bill already, even though the bill doesn't really do anything for communities. And so it's a lost opportunity, and so we try to tell people who really are like well-intentioned and like running with trying to get bills in front of legislators, like, have you actually checked in with the communities on the ground? Are they leading these efforts? What do they think are their priorities in the bill, the development of the bill, right? So that's definitely something that I would recommend.
I totally agree with that. I think the legislative champions is really important because it is a bill that will get pushback, and also it's not really well known outside of the environmental justice and climate justice communities. Even then, you don't get as much attention from a lot of the kind of more climate focused groups, although it is certainly a climate bill. You could argue both ways. But I think that it's important to have the legislative champions have someone sponsor the bill that has a lot of strength and power in the Senate and the Assembly, and is able to really move that forward, and also be able to, and also, like Anna said, will really defer to the environmental justice groups on decision making. That makes a really big difference, especially when it comes to negotiating language, what stays, what goes, negotiating with people who are in opposition. That is really critical. I'll also say something that we were really excited and will certainly continue to sort of lean on is the legislative intent of a bill. Really spend time in your state trying to advise on that and influence on what the legislative intent states at the beginning of the bill, because that can also be really important when the rulemaking process happens and when permits are submitted, because it really says very clearly what the objective of this legislation is supposed to do. And it makes it harder for anyone that's opposing a legislation or wanting to kind of push back on permit decisions. It makes it harder for them to kind of move around the environmental justice provisions. And so the New York legislative intent, and you can literally copy and paste from different states. Like that's also okay, by the way, do it. But the New York one says like, this is because certain environmental justice communities are overburdened, and we are actively working on that. And that is the point of the legislation. So if there's work being done where that point is not staying central, there is this pillar to lean back on. And then lastly, I kind of already said it, but the third thing is the existing facility stuff is so important, and it is really hard, and not every state is going to be open to having some language there. But start with the most robust, aggressive version of getting existing facilities to reduce their burden. We started with existing facilities have to eliminate their burden by the time they apply for their next permit renewal. And, it doesn't hurt to start with the ideal, and, you'll probably have to work down from that realistically. But it's really important to have that and to spend some time working with different kind of stakeholders that are related to the space to kind of figure out what language really works, because that piece will be really, really critical for pretty much every community in every state.
Thank you both. Yeah, that's really helpful. These are really helpful tips. And as we wait for questions to trickle in, I'd love to pass it over to Lou, who's our senior fellow at Just Solutions, to give us some more information on how how this relates to the federal level and what EPA is or isn't doing, and more there. So Lou, take it away.
Sure. Yeah. First of all, thank you, Anna and Sonal, for joining us, taking time out of what I'm guessing are your very busy schedules, given these times that we're living in. I'm curious about how what's happening on the ground in New Jersey and New York with permits for new gas, for example, like Fall Solutions. Like how are you viewing the deployment of these new laws in terms of stopping CCS, stopping hydrogen co-firing, for example, for the power sector or heat, right? I'm just curious how this assault by the Biden administration of Fall Solutions, how you are processing that at the state level.
Yeah, we haven't seen, to my knowledge, proposals yet hit the ground on new permits for CCS and hydrogen. It's just starting to be talked about, particularly hydrogen co-firing for existing. So this is the tricky part, is like, depending on how these proposals are coming in, most of them are probably going to come in as modifications to existing plants. And right now, we haven't seen any major proposals for modifications, although we anticipate that might happen on the horizon. Also, the hydrogen hubs proposal there's one in the Mid-Atlantic, right in South Jersey and Delaware, Pennsylvania. They haven't yet said where those if there will be any new facilities or where exactly they'll be. So depending on where they are, whether or not they'll trigger, they certainly would trigger if they are in New Jersey, they would trigger this law. But if it's an existing plant where there, for example, an existing natural gas plant and Newark says, well, we want to add hydrogen co-firing, it would be a permit modification. And then we, unlike New York, we can require certain modification conditions to mitigate any emissions contributions. which may make it difficult for them to implement, but not impossible to implement. So in other words, they can't outright deny it, but they can put enough conditions on it that might make it difficult. But we haven't seen that many. I mean, I've heard of 1 or 2 CCS and hydrogen, but they're still in the proposal being talked about, but not in the permitting triggering phase. But yeah, I think we're gonna have to think through, like, when it's not triggering a new facility, how do these cumulative impacts laws come into play?
And Sonal, how does the Section 7.2 of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, how does that play into the new permitting law?
Yeah, there's a lot of conversation about that. And I'll say, like, because this cumulative impacts law hasn't yet actually been, come into play yet. We have January 2025. I guess your original question remains to be seen how it will fully work. But gas infrastructure is included. If you need a Title V air quality permit for any kind of project, then the project is located in disadvantaged community as defined by the state, like, you will be subject to this law. So I do think, and at least I hope, that this law will add some more rigor to the way that fall solution, different facilities being proposed that promote fall solutions will be evaluated. And then for existing facilities, like, if existing facilities do want to make some kind of major modification, then they are also subject to this as well. So we hope that will help. But what's nice about New York is we can hang our hat on a second thing, which is the state's climate law. Section 7.2 and 7.3 both can be really helpful here and are already coming into effect. And we've seen the state already deny permit. That was really exciting about, I don't know, was it 2 years ago now? It feels like it was just yesterday, for a gas infrastructure because of its contribution to disproportionate burden. And it's outlined in the state's climate law that any kind of actions by agencies and any kind of sort of climate interventions have to be really, it says, like, you have to be actively reducing emissions in just overburdened communities is essentially what it says. There is a little bit of a disagreement on the interpretation of that, I'll say, by different interest groups, namely a question about, like, where do utilities fall in this is a conversation folks have been having. But yeah, we think that the state's climate law is really protective, and the cumulative impacts legislation, we think, is hopefully kind of adding extra teeth and giving DEC more power to continue to deny permits or get modifications for permits, and that it's not just focused on the greenhouse gas emissions, but it can also be really, forward in terms of pollution, water contamination. It can be making decisions based on that as well, which we think adds a lot of teeth. So we hopefully think they go well together overall, and will be kind of, I know DEC is working on the rulemaking for cumulative impacts with a mind towards CLCPA section 7.2 and 7.3 and how they should all be married together and make sense together versus be kind of in opposition or be confusing in any way. So I know that they're kind of thinking about this simultaneously.
Sonal, could you just brief our audience? So Section 7.1 is the climate standard, is that correct? And then Section 7.2 is the disadvantaged community standard. Is that correct in the law?
Sorry, so I'll double check so I don't give the language wrong. Off the top of my head, it's section 7.2 and 7.3. 7.2 says like agencies have to be reducing greenhouse gas emissions and their decisions have to be doing that. And then section 7.3, which is the one that environmental justice groups talk about more, is that decisions on climate adaptation mitigation cannot disproportionately burden disadvantaged communities. So
right.
they're very similar. I think certain decisions are covered by both, but they are technically a little bit different. And the second one really does name the disproportionate burden by disadvantaged communities, whether we think that's the best language or not. That's what it says. So Section 7.2 and 7.3 are those two important ones. And I can put a link that describes.
Am I right that like a couple of gas permits have already been denied under Section 7.2, the climate standard, the zero emissions electricity system standard by 2040, right? Is that right?
Yeah, so there was a groundbreaking one that DEC denied a permit for gas infrastructure just about a year ago, and they cited Section 7.3. It might have been both. I'll double check and put it in the chat for everyone. But yeah, they used the climate law to deny that that pollution. So that was really exciting.
I'd love to get started on some of the questions from the Q&A. I know, Anna, you mentioned a little bit about working or the tensions with industry and having to work through that. And so we have a question from Jose Coronado who asks, do you have advice dealing with key legislators who have immense public campaign donations from polluting industry, or, you know, something around that like area where you have to deal with industry?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you should just assume that's going to happen no matter what state you're in. You're going to have those interests heavily influencing legislators. And the degree to which they have influence and power at any one time can fluctuate, and obviously depends on your state and the dynamics of your state. You know, those are folks that are not going to ever be convinced, no matter what data you have or how good your argument is. It's very difficult to move those people other than using political organizing, like base building, you know, tactics that can corner or isolate people. We were lucky that we were able to pull together enough. One, we had the governor's endorsement before the bill was even introduced, which was very unusual. Typically, the governor likes to stay out of it until there's like an actual bill being discussed. And in this case, you know, it was, you know, sort of, you know, a moment of COVID, and Black Lives Matter movement was very strong in the state at the time. And there were all these people making statements about racial justice. And it was an opportunity, I think, for advocates to push the governor into a situation to make a public statement of support, to signal to the legislators that they wanted to do something on this bill. So again, it's like being attentive to like, where do you have an opportunity window to kind of push legislation? And then again, we also organized a coalition of urban mayors, the Urban Mayors Association, which in New Jersey has a very strong standing because we have very big urban centers in New Jersey. We're very urban based population along that corridor, industrial corridor. So having endorsement and support from the Black Caucus and, you know, different parts of the legislators to really bring them along and help organize their colleagues. But yes, we had a lot of opposition. We had a lot of machinations. We had labor unions that started to side with the Chemistry Council and Business and Industry Alliance. You know, they tried to get to all the legislators and continued to do so all the way through the rulemaking up until the final rule. And now there is a challenge to the rule by Scrap Metals Association and the Business and Industry Lobby, who are, you know, challenging the rule, which we had anticipated, but it never ends, right? Like their opposition, you should just anticipate and know that you are going to get challenged every step of the way, even after the rule is passed. They're going to keep trying to kill the bill and kill its implementation.
Donald, do you have any advice on this issue?
Yeah, I think what I don't know if this works everywhere. I think everyone in every state is different, and the folks that they're dealing with are different. But for New York, it worked for us to spend time talking to our opposition. As much as we knew who they were, we were able to identify some of the key people or the key entities, and we spent a lot of time kind of working with them and negotiating with them, essentially. I think that that really helped a lot because we did end up coming to some common ground on a couple things that we felt were still safe for achieving the importance of the law. But at the same time, what was special about New York and why the legislative sponsor is so important, we had an incredibly powerful sponsor who was the Senate sponsor was the leader of the Senate in New York. And that, of course, means there is in just major power there that is pretty hard to for the opposition to overcome if the sponsor wants to move the bill forward. So that made a very large difference in terms of, negotiating with the opposition. But we will also just have to see, I think since we're a little bit behind New Jersey, we'll have to see who kind of comes out of the woodworks. We imagine folks will. I think one thing that was also strategic that we did was that we really did not, in the campaign, we did not talk about this bill as a climate bill, because we knew that the word climate and climate change would draw opposition pretty immediately, and that it was better to keep it as an a pollution burden, environmental justice legislation, because we thought we would see less opposition that way. And it turned out, at least I think, to be right, that some of the major players that spend a lot of time opposing climate legislation in New York did not spend time on this bill. So yeah, there's a couple things there, but yeah, I guess we'll still have to see where it goes.
Thank you. Yeah, we have another question in the chat, which I think this is for Sonal. Who is a burden of proof on? Is it the permit applicant or other parties for section 7.3? And maybe I could does that make sense? Or
Yeah, I think so. So the applicant has to do when filing for a permit. So not even considering the cumulative impacts law, just for the climate law that I posted in the chat. The applicant files their permit. They have to kind of go through the EIS process, environmental impact process, that is kind of traditional to a lot of states that New York has. And then the State Department of Environmental Conservation evaluates those permits, and then they go back to the applicant and ask for more proof or deny it or whatever action that they want to make. So I would say an imperfect process, the burden of proof would be on the applicant, but it also, the power is with the state and a municipality, if depending on what the permit is, it could be like a city permit. The burden is with the agency to approve or deny or ask for more information. So yeah, I don't think that's a perfect process, but that is kind of what we have.
Thank you. And I think we have time for maybe one more question, which I'll put here. We got a question from Delaware where they have gotten some pushback from folks on from folks either wanting to tie it to tangible health impacts, which we know or they know doesn't work, or that the Clean Air Act itself needs changes. Did you all come across similar pushback in your states? Anna, I don't know if you were raising your hand to answer the question. Sorry.
That was a mistake. Sorry.
Okay, good.
No, I don't think we got that that type of pushback in terms of like pegging it to health outcomes, as the commenter suggested. That's not a typical way to do it. I'll put in the chat, we did look at, my center at the New School, we put together a compendium of all the proposed, enacted, and model legislation around cumulative impacts and the methodologies that have been proposed or worked on, to get a sense of like what's the universe of how cumulative impacts can be looked at, because prior to these laws, that what you're seeing in New York, New Jersey is fairly novel in that it attaches these standards to actual determinative permit decisions and regulatory laws. In the past, for the past 10, 20 years, the work on cumulative impacts has been largely around analytics, like devising tools that may or may not get used in any substantive policy-making way. For example, California has had the California EJ screen tool for a long time, but they don't use it in permitting, right? They use it for investment allocation. So there was like a body of knowledge we could draw from to say, well, how do you typically look at cumulative burdens? What are some of the indicators that people use? So for example, what are the public health stressors that could serve as data points for cumulative impacts determination? And we drew on that empirical body of literature to try to craft something with the regulators that was sufficient for New Jersey, because each state has their own like data sets, quality of data, and burdens that they're specifically interested in. So all of that has to be taken into account, but definitely not health outcomes, because those are usually tracked over lifetimes. And what makes cumulative impacts different from cumulative risk, which is what typically environmental impact statements and NEPA processes do, risk analysis and risk assessments. These laws are not risk-based assessments. They are indicator-based. In other words, they're relative measures of burden. And that makes it a lot more tangible and easier to make policy around, actually, because for decades, the researchers would say, well, we don't know how cumulative risk works. We don't know how chemicals interact and how synergistically they behave. And so there was decades of just research doing modeling. When in fact, communities, were like, well, we have all these burdens. If you do a simple form of relative assessment of burden, you can deduce what is cumulative, what is disproportionate. And these ideas around thresholds, I think this is one really important point that communities have to remember so they don't get trapped in this cycle of analysis paralysis, is that these determinations of what's cumulative, what's disproportionate, these are normative decisions. These are political determinations. There's no one right answer to that, right? Is it a 50% threshold, an 80% threshold? That is something that, is not derived empirically. It's derived out of a political process of what's fair and what's just. And so we have to always remind ourselves that those determinations should be made by the communities, the EJ groups that are on the ground in those negotiations about being back and forth. So yeah, don't let them push you around into indicators that or analysis, too much analysis. Let's study this for 10 more years. Don't do that.
Yeah, so no, and any thoughts on this? I know we were all shaking our heads, so I know we all agree on this.
Yeah, no, I think Anna answered it perfectly.
No worries. Yeah, so I think we're at time. I'm gonna pass it to Taylor to close us out, but just appreciate all your expertise you shared today. Both Anna and Sonal, thank you for being with us, and Taylor, take it away.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you all. Thanks, Idamis and Lou and Sonal and Anna for sharing your insights with us today. I am going to drop in the chat our post-event survey. I know there's still tons of questions. I feel like we could talk about this for like 4 hours straight and not run out of things to discuss. But if you have any questions left, please feel free to leave them in the post-event survey. Let us know what kinds of other spaces would be helpful for you in doing your work. and let us know your thoughts on this event today. Again, I want to extend so much gratitude to our presenters for making time to speak with us and connect with us. And I hope you all have a great rest of your week and a wonderful weekend. Thank you.